Welcome everyone to the first session of One Stop Business Workshop. My name is Lisa Clarkson. I lead the Business and Rights team at CBC and I'll be your moderator. One Stop is a series of introductory sessions for emerging producers and creators from groups that have faced systemic barriers and racism and who are underrepresented in our media industry. That is Indigenous peoples, visible minorities, LGBTQ2+ persons, women, and persons with a disability. We wish to acknowledge those Indigenous nations on whose land we live and work. We're gathering virtually with people from across the country today. Since the land acknowledgements are specific to each of your regions, we urge you to visit the National Land Digital website, the Native Land Digital website, to identify the First Nations territories on which you're located. So today you'll be hearing from Marcia Douglas, who will give you an introduction on setting up your business. Marcia is the Senior Director of Business Affairs and Digital Initiatives at the CMPA. CMPA is an organization which represents independent producers in the media industry. Prior to joining CMPA, Marcia worked at the Bell Fund and has been an assistant director and a production manager. Today's session will be 30 minutes long. We'll try and stay strictly to that time limit. There'll be 20 minutes of content, 10 minutes for your questions at the end. I'll ask Marcia the questions you provided when you signed up. You can email me any questions you have during the session at lisa.clarkson@cbc.ca, and you can find my email on your evite for this session. Any and all questions are welcome. The presentation, a video version of the presentation, and some of the follow-up materials will also be available on CBC's Business and Rights website after the session. So with that introduction, I turn it over to Marcia.
Thanks, Lisa, and thank you to everyone for being here. We're very excited. This is an initiative that, and thank you to Lisa and her team, and also to CAVCO. This is something that the CMPA and CBC and CAVCO have been working on for a little while. We did an in-person session in Halifax, and unfortunately, we couldn't do more in-person sessions right now, but we're very excited to actually be trying it this way because it means people from all over the country and maybe beyond can join us. So today, we're focused on just one topic, and there'll be more. So throughout the presentation, I might point to future sessions. So make sure to check out all of the sessions for more information. So first slide. So today's presentation is about getting started setting up your business. Sorry, Pooja, can you again? Thank you. So the sort of key topics are, what is a production company, which is a lot about what's your goal, why should I create a company or when? So that's about creating legal entities for your productions. What's next? Who else do I need to work with in terms of going forward? And some other things to think about. So next slide. So you want to be a producer. Some things to think about are why do you want to be a producer? And who are producers? What is a producer? So a producer is a creator, they're a storyteller, they're driven by passion, they need a lot of tenacity. I wish it was easy to think about what a job description is of a producer, but it can be a lot of different things. That person can identify the properties, or they can work with the creators. They come up with their own ideas. They are often part of collecting the financing for a production, identifying the sources, negotiating with them, putting up their own money sometimes, finding, again, working with some of the agencies, and there will be future sessions around this, but just sort of ideas to think through. And they are also part of bringing together all of the elements of that production, making sure it comes together on time and on budget, and sees that vision through, or works with the creators to see their vision through. And in reality, they are sometimes the parent, the chauffeur, a therapist, a crisis manager. There are a lot of different hats. Next, what is a production company? So things to think about are what kinds of works do you want to produce? What kind of responsibilities do you want to take on as a producer? You know, what is your vision? So what would make your company unique and distinct? And then we can talk a little bit about, should you start your own company or work with an existing company? So a place to start once you have an idea or even if you don't have an idea, if we're looking for opportunities, is to look at financing that's available in the market. And we're very lucky in Canada to have a lot of different funds, but it's important then to look at the rules. And those can range from arts councils, which tend to finance creators more directly, and sort of the nature of that financing is different, to other funds. And again, check out future sessions with things like the Canada Media Fund or CMF or Telefilm or other private funds. And when you look through their guidelines and at their website, you'll start to see what they finance and also some of the requirements around who the applicants are and if they need to be incorporated. And we'll get to that in a second. You can think about partnerships. Maybe you don't want to form your own company. So who do you want to work with locally? Are there other producers you want to work with? Or very often, if you want to work internationally, you really will need to form a production company to do things like international co-productions. You should think about the different phases of production and what your role will be in both development, production, and potentially distribution or selling of the works. And things to keep in mind are, as your business grows, your expenses will generally grow. So if you have to, get an office or you're hiring more staff, but even from the beginning, you'll need to think about things like travel and accessing those things to sort of get your ideas into market and to do the right meetings. And a question that you might ask yourself is also, well, how do producers make money? How do these companies make money? So usually, if you raise financing to either develop or produce your project, producers get fees as a percentage of the budget that's to pay for their work, and also corporate overhead to help run their companies to a degree. The thing is, those funds will tend to flow within the budgets of either development or production, but there's often a lot of sweat equity and investment that you have to put in yourself before and after. And once you make those works, you typically are reporting on a production for the rest of its life, like for many, many years. So that's why you start to see more corporate structures. Other ways that people make money are selling the works once they're made. And there are lots of new models with things like YouTube, for example, where you're making money through advertising as you make the work and post the work. Next slide. So the next slide is why should I create a company and when? So you can register your own company. You don't necessarily need a lawyer, although it could be advisable. We can talk about that. There are different types of companies. Something fun but really important is things like deciding on a name. And you should really think about a business plan. It's not something that needs to be firmly set in stone, but you really want to use the tools to think about what's your vision for your company and what does that look like on a 6-month, 12-month, 3-year, 5-year kind of business. Like when you're going out to raise financing, you won't necessarily be asked for your business plan by things like CMF or Telefilm, but if you're trying to bring in other financing, potentially your rich uncle, for example, they're going to want to know what your plan is. And it's good for you to have those goals in mind because you can circle back and check in. So we have a link here, for example, to the BDC's website for some tools around business plans. In terms of deciding on a name, Google your name, look on IMDb, because one of the things, and we'll talk about brand in 2 more slides, but you want to build a brand for your company. So you want to make a website, register your social. So you want to make sure you're picking a company name that works, that isn't offensive, that maybe it's catchy or reflects your business and what that looks like. And in terms of company types, the reason why you need a separate company, there's a couple of different reasons. So the 2 kinds of companies I think we'll most often see in the film and television or digital entertainment space are sole proprietorships and incorporations. So often from a creator perspective or even crew, you'll see sole proprietorship. So those are business types for an individual. And it's a really easy type of business to form, but it's not usually a production company because the reason why you would want to incorporate or form a separate company is because it further limits liability. And also it will be a requirement if you're working with a lot of the industry partners. So as an example, if you're working with a broadcaster or if you're working with a fund, they can only give that money to a standalone incorporation that will keep separate books. And what that does is it helps track the money separately and all of the accounting and the reporting. It helps track the rights. So that's something that we'll talk about on Friday as part of chain of title. And It also limits your personal liability. So as a sole proprietorship, if there was an accident on set or as part of your production, you can be held personally responsible. Whereas if all of the activity is run through the company, it's the company that's held responsible, not you personally. So it helps protect all of the financiers and all of the partners. And again, there will be sessions on working with a broadcaster, for example, but equally, I think Lisa would also say that working with CBC, when they give out money, it's again to companies, not individuals. So most of the time, you're going to incorporate a company. Move to the next slide. So in terms of what's next, so you have your company, and before you register, you may want to think about some of these things too. You have, let's say, a name and idea of what you want to do. And again, you may wish to do this when you actually have a project that you're trying to apply for, but some of the funds, they won't require you to incorporate that company until you're actually awarded funding. You really have to check individually with each fund or each program what they'll allow. Absolutely, for some, you're going to have to be incorporated before you apply, but for others, you can make those applications, and then if you're awarded financing to move forward with your project, that's when you would incorporate. And the other layer I would add is once you're getting to that point, you may wish to consider not only incorporating a parent company, but it's very common in this industry to incorporate a single purpose company for every different project. Because again, when we talk about that, those both the accounting and sort of responsibilities and also the liability, those get held in each individual single purpose company. And that extends even to different seasons of a television series, for example. So season 1 would be one incorporation and season 2 would be another one. And they may both be under what we would call a parent company umbrella. So other key elements once you're sort of starting to get started in this business space are, once you have incorporated or have your company, whether it's sole proprietorship, you need a separate bank account, because as all of that great funding that's going to flow through to you needs to flow into a bank account, and it can't be your own personal account. It has to be a corporate account. You're going to need an accountant to help you track all those books. And once you have a company, you have to do corporate tax returns on that company annually, in addition to your own personal taxes. You're going to need a lawyer, and you may wish to engage that lawyer from the beginning to help you set up and structure your company or companies properly, especially if you're working with a partner or more than one person. It could be a very good idea, and you should each have your own lawyer to make sure that you're structuring that company in a way that protects both of you, and that there's a clear understanding of both of your roles and responsibilities and what that partnership looks like. So a lawyer can help you set that up. And in fact, most media and entertainment lawyers are well versed to do at least that part for our industry. And then from the media and entertainment side going forward, you will use your lawyer to help you engage potentially on financing, on chain of title, which again, we'll talk about on Friday, on talent agreements, potentially. There's a lot of reasons why you would engage your lawyer in different ways. So when we talked about that business plan and thinking about costs and revenue opportunities, these are generally more costs, but they're key operational things that as you grow, or even on your first project, you're going to really have to think about who's wearing those hats. And it might be you if it's a small company, but you really want to be able to track these things and think it through. And what other expertise you need, that's one of the other things you need to think about. So every company, we talked about that business plan. Who are the partnerships? What are the gaps and things that you know or don't know that you may want to find a partner on? That could be anybody from social media and marketing to sales. Like that's when you're going out there, and you can think about working with a distributor as a partner, or working potentially with your broadcaster as a partner in getting the work made and then getting it to an audience. And one of the things I actually meant to flag is when you're thinking about business planning, there's actually a very specific program called BAMF Spark for women-led companies right now. And we can post the link to that probably on the Business and Rights website. But I think they've just announced their second cohort, and that is a program to help develop women-led businesses and to develop those business plans. And it's specific to the media and entertainment space, although you don't all have to be producers. So just mentioning that as a resource and opportunity. Next slide, Pooja. Thanks. So other things to consider, we talked a little bit about building your brand. So just because of the time that we live in now, it's like when you walk past a store and they don't have, and then you see something in the window, but it's closed because everything's closed right now. And then you go home and you Google it. If they don't have a website, do they exist? So think about when we get into marketing and promotion of also having your own brand, both for your company and even potentially for you personally. When you work with different partners, they're going to want to look you up. So it doesn't have to be fancy, but you want a website that reflects who you are, what your company is, and tells your story. And sometimes there's lots of websites out there that are just like, not just quite work in progress, but they just have like a clean graphic with contact info, because the next thing we'll talk about a little bit is networking. So outside of that, park your social media handles, right? Insta, Facebook, Twitter, whatever you think you may be using, so that you own those elements of your brand. You don't have to launch everything right away, but you need to think of these elements. You're building a business. And again, in that planning perspective, what does that look like? And even if you're not ready to launch your production company, you as a person, as a creator, think about your personal brand and what that is. Just looking at the time, we're okay. So networking will be key to sort of growing your business and your company. That will become part of pitching. That's part of building those opportunities. I would like to dispel the myth that you have to have direct personal relationships in order to get funding or in order to get your project picked up and pitched. But it's not that, but you need to be able to present yourself and your company and your projects. And it's good to practice with your colleagues, with your coworkers. And this like ekes a little bit into that identifying opportunities. So when we think about opportunities, we talked a little bit earlier about financing and funding and how that can lead some of this, but there's also a ton of virtual and community opportunities to get more involved in the film and television space in Canada. And what I would say is the small silver lining of what's happening right now with COVID that's removed our ability to gather together is there's a bit of an equalizer happening and also opening up new opportunities. So next week, as an example, Banff, which normally is held in the Rockies at this time of year, and you would have to pay to fly there, and you would have to pay, a significant amount for a pass to participate and have those networking opportunities and those learning opportunities, has a free pass. So you can log on to the Banff Media Festival right now and sign up for some of their sessions and see, for example, there's a media leaders panel next week where the Canadian and international media leaders will talk about the state of the industry and what's happening. And I do think they also have a paid pass, but again, it's significantly more affordable, although still with a cost than their normal passes would be, where you can do sessions that are called 30 minutes with, to hear from buyers, or even coffees with, to access experts and professionals in the film and television industry. And a lot of the conferences and festivals are doing that. So, it wouldn't surprise me. Well, I can't say, but there's lots of different festivals. If you were interested in the kids space, for example, there's a conference that takes place in Sheffield called the Children's Media Conference once a year that's coming up, that's all virtual, and I think it's free. Or there's an international prize, again, in the kids space right now called the Prix Jeunesse that only happens every 2 years. And again, you can log on and it's free. And then on Facebook, again, to talk about identifying opportunities, there's tons of Facebook groups you might want to join. Anything from Inc. Canada, if you're interested in writing. There's a terrific group called BIPOC that is a community gathering space for people who are Black, Indigenous, or people of colors to come together as creative to talk about both opportunities and some of the challenges they're facing. If you're looking for work, there's I Need a Fixer Canada. There is a group called Coronavirus Television Film in Toronto that's very specific about how the industry is getting back going. Just to say, like, take advantage of those opportunities. Don't feel shy about asking how to reach out and build on where you're going. Insurance, I leave this here for now, but it is a key element of, as you grow your business, as you move forward, it will become a requirement. Certainly, if you get into actual production, you're going to need insurance, but it's something that may form part of your business strategy. Other things to think about is, as you're becoming an employer or an engager, you're going to need certain policies in place. They should exist just like any other workplace. As you build your company, you need to keep in mind things like anti-harassment or workplace violence. You may wish to have more positive policies around diversity and inclusion, as an example. There's a lot of those things to keep in mind, and as you grow, you need to consider that when it's more than just you. In terms of, and there will be another session down the road on working with the unions and guilds. So tune in for that to talk about that. But what I'll just say is, as a producer, you can also always reach out to organizations like the CMPA to talk about what that means from the lens of the producer, and again, as an employer, as an engager. And then lastly, two other quick things which have to do with sort of gaining more experience, or schools and training. There are a lot of schools, both the universities and colleges, that have programs. There's also professional level schools such as the NSI and the CFC, if you're interested in developing more in a specific role, or developing certain elements of your craft, as well as a lot of the festivals or community organizations that a lot of you, I think that's how you're finding out about this, have some terrific programs that you may want to look at. And the CMPA also has, and we can post this link too, we have a mentorship program that's specific to producers. We actually have a variety of them. So we'll post a link to our website if you're interested in, like, the CMPA's mentorship programs, for example, are a paid mentorship program that is usually 4 to 6 months. And the idea is to place people across the country in different production companies so they can learn more about producing and elements of production companies and how they operate. And those are rotating. I don't think we have any open right now, but again, that's a good opportunity if it works for you. And then there's things like Lyft and co-ops, depending on where you are. So I think that is it for, oh, sorry, I will just say there's one more thing that we're going to post to the CBC website, which is links to provincial business registrations, to go back to where you yourself could potentially do this. We just wanted to give you where you can look depending on where you are. You can think about incorporating either nationally or provincially, although I think most companies in our industry tend to incorporate provincially where they are. So we just thought it would be helpful to give you those links.
Thanks, Marcia. So I'm going to try and get through as many questions for Marcia as I can. The first one is, what are some common mistakes and solutions when setting up a business?
What a good question. So common issues, I think, would just be probably to start with maybe setting up a different structure than you possibly need. That's where I think it can be good to work with a lawyer. There are other more complicated business structures like limited partnerships and things that may or may not be allowed depending on how they're structured. So just be mindful in thinking about that. I would say in most cases you can keep things simple. I think another common one would be really understanding your responsibilities from the accounting side and from a taxation side. It's something that's actually come up more recently as part of COVID-19 and some of the government supports. The other thing that will happen is you'll have to make choices about how you pay yourself and how you pay people as part of your company. And there are tax implications on one side, and then potentially when it comes to things like access to government supports, there's just choices that need to be made. And that's very individual, that you really have to think about with your accountant in that particular case. And things to even consider when you're doing it is when you set your corporate year end, right? What makes sense for your company, the types of projects you're doing. It's not significant. I don't think it's nothing that can't be fixed. It's just things to think through.
Thanks. What about challenges for a new producer or content creator from a member of a cultural community or a newcomer to Canada? Are there any challenges that you want to highlight and address?
I wish I could say that there weren't specific challenges. I think it really depends. I think from the government perspective, there's a lot of support to establishing businesses for anyone. And certainly all of the funds are open to working, like they should, none of them should have any discriminatory practices. They do not, as far as I am aware. However, I think a key thing to note in terms of if you're building a film and television company based around the financing, and again, as we talked about, that's not necessary, but if you're going to build it to make, let's say, film in Canada and principally think that you're going to want to access things like telefilm. If you read through their guidelines, a lot of the focus will be on English, French, or Indigenous language production first and foremost, and that's because of the Official Languages Act in Canada. So it's not to say that you can't make projects in other languages, but you may also need to make projects in English or French or an Indigenous language. And I know that doesn't sound like it's based necessarily in setting up your business, but again, when you're working through a business and that business strategy and planning, you should think about, what's your product, who's your customer, where's the revenue going to come into your business, and so I think that's just something to think about.
If this is a bit of a longer question, but there's a couple related to this. If one has a parent company already, does it make more sense to form a single purpose company at the development phase, or does it make more sense to wait until the production phase when it's guaranteed that the project will move forward?
That's a good question. I think it's complicated. It really depends on the project itself a little bit. Like, as an example, if you were going to do a co-production even at the development phase, like CMF has multiple programs that do international development, then you're going to want a separate company so that you and your co-producer are working through that. You can, I feel like this is getting a little into sort of inside baseball language, but you can sort of clean it up in the chain of title and assign the rights later if you want it to stay in development. But we would also potentially see situations very early on where there's a parent company and then there's a development company, and that development company houses all of the development projects potentially too. Like, there's a few sort of different ways to do it depending on what kind of projects you're doing, how you're financing them.
Name search. How do we find out if our company's name is unique?
Right. So we can post a link to that because there are lots of government databases that you can do that. Ultimately, at least in your registration, you don't necessarily need to pick that because otherwise you'll just get a numbered company. But it can help you to differentiate your company, and ultimately you will want to sort of clear it. But again, you can start with Google and IMDb from the sort of public brand facing side of the perspective, but we'll get you the link so that you can also do a database search of registered corporations, both federally and I think and provincially it does.
And we're getting a few questions about follow-up. We will try and post as many of the links that Marcia has mentioned and the organizations as possible. So we won't use our time to go back over those, but please do look for them on the website. You talked about this a little bit in your networking, but one of the questions is, if I'm an emerging artist with few contacts during the pandemic, what's the first step I should take to get started?
So that's a great question. I think it kind of depends on what you're trying to do. So if you're a writer and you're trying to write, as I mentioned, an option, for example, is there's an Ink Canada Facebook group. You can look at the Writers Guild, for example, and their Facebook groups. If you want to be a producer, you can look at the CMPA or as I mentioned, things like Lyft or different schools. Like, they have alumnus groups. I think I would start almost in social media, especially during the pandemic, because it's harder to do hangouts or in person. But I think there's been some terrifically innovative new ways to sort of work together. I'm just trying to think, Lisa, down the road, and maybe we can see how this is going if we wanted to create a Facebook group for everyone who signs up for this as emerging creators and artists and voices. And if you want to collaborate together, maybe that's some feedback people can give in the survey after this one, if they're interested.
When you're incorporating a company, but you've got two people that are involved, how do you go about splitting the ownership, or do you?
Again, I think that's one where you actually might even want to get a lawyer involved from the very beginning to make sure it's clear and to make sure that it's structured properly. There are things to keep in mind. I know it sounds like down the road, but even things around tax credits, where you want to make sure that things are laid out properly in terms of any control, like producer control issues, and checking those boxes. And when we get into things like tax credit eligibility, it sounds super detailed, so we can follow up in a future session, or if you can look through the guidelines. But the structures of your companies inform sometimes who's eligible for what. Although most of the time in incorporation, it doesn't matter how many people are part of it, but just to protect your interests, you really want to make sure that you have a clear understanding from the beginning of who owns what and what each of those responsibilities are, both on a formal corporate level and then really even on that day-to-day level. And maybe you're forming this company with your best friend or your brother or your spouse. And just, it's a good idea, again, even up front, just to make sure that everyone has an understanding from the ownership and again, from the fiduciary duties and from a day-to-day perspective, so that it's clear when there's a dispute. Not that you'll have any disputes.
Thanks, Marcia. Well, we're out of time, unbelievably. It goes by so fast. We'll try and share as much as we can on the website. Marcia went through so many helpful contacts. So thank you so much, Marcia, for helping initiate us to the world of how to set up a business. We hope that you as our audience found this useful, and you'll be able to join us at another one-stop business workshop session. They're running every afternoon at 2 o'clock Eastern time until July 3rd. So thank you for tuning in for this first one.
Thank you.